Can folks hear me? Okay. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, welcome. My name is Lisa Hatterline. I'm the Executive Director of the Land Conservancy of McHenry County, and I'm also a network architect with the Vital Lands Illinois project that's run out of Grand Victoria Foundation. Thank you all for joining us on this Vital Summit. If you haven't been on one before, it's like a webinar, but better. It's a little more interactive. It's a really good system. So we're very excited today to welcome Ashley Maybanks from the Nature Conservancy. She is the Nature Conservancy of Illinois' Director of Government Relations, and Brook McDonald, who is the President and CEO at the Conservation Foundation in Naperville. And they're going to be talking about conservation messaging in today's political climate. Just another brief comment about Vital Lands is Vital Lands is a project that has a vision of having an interconnective system of natural resources where humans, wildlife, and everything else thrives in Illinois. So I didn't say that as well as I could have, but yeah, but anyway, so, and I'm seeing John Centel is under Brook McDonald's name now, but
he wishes.
okay. We've got two Brook McDonalds.
Brook, you never look so good.
So as Todd pointed out, here's the agenda, which is pretty straightforward. So we're going to save questions for after the discussion. You'll be able to enter questions along the way in chat as we go. And then at the very end, there's going to be a 2-question evaluation. And so I would just ask folks to wait until the link to the evaluation comes up, till you click on that to close out from the session, because the evaluation is very helpful for us in organizing future programs like this. So Todd, did you want to put up the questions?
There you go.
Okay, so like I said, just as you have questions during the presentation, just go ahead, type those into chat, and we'll address those first when we are done with the presentations. And then just wanted to give you a heads up on 3 additional questions where we're going to have some discussion at the end of the presentation. So what surprises you? What stands out? Given the data presented and your knowledge of voters, what additional messages do you think might resonate widely? And then what ideas do you have for getting these messages out to the populations that need to hear them? So just have those in the back of your mind, and we'll talk about it at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ashley to get us started.
Great. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Give me just a couple of seconds here to get the presentation up on the screen. Okay, so hopefully you guys are all seeing the same thing, and hopefully it's not too pixelated. And I am gonna rely on folks to tell me if I start. Apparently. So anyway, and it already says I'm unstable, so that's good. Nothing we don't already know. So Brook and I had this conversation a couple of months ago, maybe, where we both had conducted polls for our organizations, and we're coming up with very similar results. And so we thought that it would be really interesting, and hopefully for other people to hear what we found and see some of the results that we were seeing, especially those that overlapped. So with that, I'll jump into my Nature Conservancy conducted was done earlier in the spring in late April and was primarily designed to help the Nature Conservancy advocate for additional funding in a capital budget for conservation. And so that was primarily the reasoning behind why we conducted this poll in the first place. For those of you interested in the methodology, here's a couple of bullet points very quickly. Our pollsters conducted 800 interviews with likely November 2020 voters. There was a 3.5% margin of error. And then in some cases, we were able to compare these results to questions that we had asked in a similar poll in 2009. And so I will point out where there are some comparisons that can be made to that poll. We didn't repeat the poll exactly because they were done for different reasons, but there are some areas where we have some comparisons that can be made. These are our pollsters. I just thought I would credit them because they did all of the work. Dave Metz from FM3 and Lori Weigel from Newbridge Strategy. They have been our go-to pollsters for the entire organization for several years now. We, the Nature Conservancy, have used them across almost all 50 states. And so I highly recommend them if folks are considering doing their own polling, or let us know if you're interested in more polling and we will work with them again because they are very fantastic folks to work with. And I will also note it's on here, but they are a bipartisan team. And so Dave sort of does the Democratic side and Lori does the Republican side. So we wanted to make sure we had a nice bipartisan representation in this poll. So just and the 2019 poll, we really just wanted a baseline to get an idea of how voters felt the state of Illinois was doing, whether the state of Illinois was headed in the right direction or the wrong direction. And the results are pretty much the same in both polls. A majority of voters feel like Illinois is not headed in the right direction, which is probably not super surprising for those of us who have lived here most of our lives. At least it wasn't that surprising for me. The pollsters indicated that this is primarily being driven by Republicans. When you do the breakdowns, about 84% of Republicans say that they feel that the state is headed on the wrong track. And so that was just a baseline question. The next couple of slides, there's going to be a lot of information on the slides, but don't try to read it all. You can kind of see some trend lines. And so I'm just going to point out a couple of high-level things that I think are important to draw your attention to. So the next set of questions we're really trying to gauge what Illinois voters felt like were the most serious urgent threats affecting conservation and environmental issues in the state of Illinois. And these results are fairly similar. Some of them are similar to answers that we got in 2009, with the exception climate change was one that we had not asked in the 2009 poll, and it was actually the only one where a majority of voters felt like was a serious, extremely serious or very serious problem affecting Illinois. The other ones, most voters felt like it wasn't too serious of a problem, as you can see in the blue lines on this slide. So, which basically means that folks aren't really sensing any urgency to address these. It doesn't mean that they don't believe that they're important. There's just not a sense of urgency for most of these, with the exception of climate change. Of protecting wildlife habitat. Hopefully I'm not frozen again. I'm getting another notification. Stable. And then quality of drinking water remained about the same. However, you'll see the difference between 2009 and 2019 in that far right column changed pretty significantly in terms of how voters felt about the loss of open space and too much growth and development. It's much less of an urgent issue now than it was in 2009. moving on, we wanted to get an estimate or a gauge of how voters felt like the state should be doing in terms of increasing funding for land, water, and wildlife protection. So we asked them the question here in general if they thought that the Illinois state government should be spending more, less, or about the same. The good news is that a majority of voters felt like the state should be spending at least somewhat or much more. Sorry about that. In funding on these issues. And so that was good. And then this was similar again to a poll in 2009 that we had done where 40% said that the state should be spending more on land and water conservation. And so this is good for us because there's a lot more support now than there was in 2009. The other thing that is good to know is that even if voters weren't necessarily indicating a preference for more funding, there's very little data from the poll that suggests that voters feel like the state should be spending less. So that is a good thing, a very good thing. And then I thought it would be interesting to kind of run through some breakdowns. And so again, a lot of information on this slide. What's important to see here is the trend that support is very strong among increasing funding for conservation among voters under 50. So you'll see the two blue lines indicate that voters feel like the state should be spending either much more or somewhat more, with those totals outlined in blue on the right-hand side. So if there are any clarifying questions on how to read these graphs, please let me know, but it's fairly straightforward. And so my mouse is very touchy today. And so again, we've been hearing for a long time that millennial support for conservation issues is quite strong. And this was also reflected in our data where the 18 to 29-year-old voters had a 72% supported increasing funding for conservation. And then among gender, women were slightly more supportive of increasing funding for conservation over men, although a majority of men. We also broke this down by party, and so we have two distinguishing graphs here. Those voters that identified either as a strong Democrat or a strong Republican, and then looking at those parties as a whole pool. And so nearly 3/4 of Democrats said that they felt that the state should be spending more, and 1/3 of even very strong Republicans felt like the state should be spending more, which is good. Breaking this down even further, we also broke this down into ethnicity. So as you can see here on this graph, voters of color offer much stronger and much broader support for increasing funding. It was nearly 90% for Latino voters, which is extremely high. And so just another metric for folks to look at. And then we also broke this down by area. So folks that identified as living in a big city versus a suburban area versus a rural area. And again, although there was more support in big city areas, there is relatively good support across all areas across the state of Illinois for increasing funding for conservation. Okay, we also asked a question that we had very positive response to. So we wanted to know, regardless of how the money were raised, in general, would a voter be willing to pay X amount in additional taxes per year if that money were dedicated to protecting land, water, and wildlife? And we got very positive results. At just $10 a year, there was more than 3/4 voter support for that measure. And then even at $40 a year, there was still 2/3 of voters were willing to pay that amount as long as it went to protecting conservation. And then we asked voters to rank their priorities in terms of how they would want this money to be spent. And consistently, not just in Illinois, but the Nature Conservancy has also done some federal polling as well. And consistently across both the national and state results, protecting drinking water remains one of the most important priorities for voters across the spectrum, across all demographics. Protecting drinking water is the single most important factor for voters. And so that ranked very highly up here, as well as other water related issues. So you'll see the third one down, voters identified that improving water quality in rivers, lakes, and streams was important, as well as the one just below that, which is conserving wetlands and lands along rivers that help prevent flooding. Other issues that ranked very highly in terms of whether it was an extremely or very important issue for voters is improving air quality and providing more opportunities for kids to get outside and enjoy nature. All of these were greater than 70%, which is high. In the mid-range, we still had a pretty good support for things like conserving fish and wildlife habitat, protecting natural areas, and supporting jobs in outdoor recreation. This is sort of that mid-tier priority range. And then lower on down the list, the relatively less urgent priorities were things like improving opportunities for outdoor recreation, building playgrounds, protecting open space. Although when you look at the crosstabs, there are some interesting points of interest that you can draw. So although these are the across the board results, there are localized issues where some of these are more important to certain groups than others. And so I'll kind of just briefly get into that here. So urban and suburban voters value protecting natural areas even more than small town and rural voters do. So you'll see here the way that this graph is designed. Again, we have the priorities over here on the left. Medium to small, and on down to the rural area. And you'll see that in the big cities and the suburban areas, support was quite high for protecting natural areas when you compare it to the other areas of the state. Similarly, outdoor recreation ranks more highly in urban areas than other parts of the state. You'll see that a majority of voters that identified living in a big city felt like this was an important issue for them, and much less so in other areas of the state. Among downstate voters, drinking water and wetland conservation were the most important issues. And you'll see that sort of highlighted over here on the right-hand side. 81% of downstate voters felt like protecting drinking water was critical for them. And then similar to another question, support for local parks and recreation is more important in Chicago than elsewhere across the state. And you'll see that highlighted here, that 64% of those that live in the Chicago region felt like this was an important issue for them. Finally, we tested some specific messages, which are listed on the next two slides. These are ranked in order of effectiveness. So we read these to the potential voters and they ranked whether these provided a strong justification for investing more funding, more state funding in natural areas. So again, water was the topmost message that was the biggest justification, followed by a statewide message. So no matter where you live in Illinois, we should be protecting land. The third most important message was one on health. The fourth one, habitat, is primarily a pollinator message. And then we get down into some of the less convincing messages. And I'll show you on the next slide, here are the actual results. So, so you'll see 62% of voters here on the first line found that a argument arguing for protecting drinking water was a very convincing justification for why the state should invest more in conservation. And then you'll see these ranked down here. And so I can explain these if folks have specific questions, but basically justifications on economic justifications, and then comparing Illinois to surrounding states were not very strong justifications for why the state should invest more. And then I have a few other breakouts that I can go through, but I think I'm out of time. So I will just kind of go through, and then we're saving questions for the end. So that is the end of my presentation. Let me stop sharing so Brook can share his.
And just remind folks that you can type questions in to the chat as you're going. A few folks have been doing that. So.
Okay, great, Ashley. Thank you. I think you're going to hear a lot of similarities to what our data says as compared to Ashley's, and that's a good thing that it's consistent. So our study that we did at the Conservation Foundation focused on northeastern Illinois, the collar counties, not Cook County, because Cook County did not have any previous data to compare to at the time. But I want to give the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation a shout out and a big thank you for funding our study. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to have done this, so thank you. I'm trying to advance, that's not advancing. Todd, help me out.
Yeah, you want me to pull up your slides, Brooke? Why don't you stop sharing and I'll share yours.
Okay, is there another button I should be pushing, or?
I had to advance with my mouse.
Oh.
So try that. Just
there you go,
clicking.
Okay, I'm good.
All right.
All right, just a little background. In northeastern Illinois, about the past 25 years or so, the voters in northeastern Illinois have approved about $1.5 billion of increasing their taxes to park districts and forest preserve districts to buy land and for other conservation measures. That's a lot of money. Of the 41 measures that have been on the ballot, 37 have passed. That's about a 90% passing rate. And I believe the national average is 70%. Even 70% is pretty darn good nationally, but up here in the collar counties, it's 90%. So I think that says a lot. And all those referenda combined have protected about 45,000 acres of land. And I know that some of you know that one thing we do is we help these agencies pass these referenda. We've been involved in more than 20 of these campaigns. So we've been doing this ever since 1997. And so we've collected a lot of polling data over the years. In fact, it's over my left shoulder right here, still sitting on the shelf. And you know, you spend 15 grand or whatever on a poll, you use it, you pass a referendum, you go drink some beer and have a good time, and then it just sits on the shelf and collects dust. And so in talking to the Donnelly Foundation, we thought it would be really cool to do an updated poll in all 6 of the collar counties to get fresh data, and then compare that data to past data in those 6 counties, and to see what has changed, what has not changed, and have the messages changed at all, and what does the voter demographic look like now as compared to in the past. So the question that we're trying to answer in our study is, how do we talk to people about conservation, particularly land conservation, in ways that connects with their values, their interests, and their concerns? So 4 of the 6 counties are in our service territory, DuPage, Kane, Kendall, and Will, and we've been doing referenda in those counties for a long time. But we also added Lake and McHenry just to complete the collar county territory, because they also had data on previous referenda that they had passed over the years. So the goals or the purpose of the study was really to look at what are the consistent regional messages that resonate with voters and the public. We want to look at county-specific nuanced messages. In other words, are the people in Lake County really concerned and interested in different things than, let's say, Kendall County? And so we wanted to look at those nuanced messages. And I can tell you that there is no difference. Everybody's the same. We also wanted to update all the polling because everyone had polling data from various points throughout the past 25 years. So now all 6 of the collar counties, we have fresh polling data from last April. And then we want, like I mentioned, we wanted to look at the trends over the past 20 years. So we found some interesting things. I can't go into a lot of detail here because we're short on time, but in comparing some of the past data in some of the different counties, it was quite interesting. in-depth demographic analysis. Have the voters changed? And in suburban areas, really throughout the entire country, the suburban voter has changed, and they're voting differently now than they were 25 years ago. And then we wanted to assess the potential for any referenda in these 6 areas in 2020. Now, we contexted our poll as a hypothetical referendum, and we wanted to do that because we wanted to be able to compare apples to apples with previous polling data we had that were centered around real live referenda, not hypotheticals. So we wanted to ask very similar questions so we can compare apples to apples. So who was surveyed? We surveyed 1,200 voters throughout the 6 collar counties, 200 in each county. And the sample the pollster drew were likely November 2020 voters. And there seems to be some consensus with the pollsters around the country that November 2020 is going to be a very different kind of election with who shows up. There's going to be a lot more younger people showing up in that election. So this is sort of what they look like. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the political affiliations. 25 years ago, the Republicans that we would have sampled would have been, 2/3 of the people would have been Republicans. A lot more people identify themselves as independents now. They don't want to be associated with any of the parties, probably can understand that. But a lot more Democrats, and you can see that it's pretty even now. So at least in our collar counties, the pollster feels this is probably representative of who will show up in November 2020. I'm going to jump right into the messages here. So these messages, and again, this is about water. This is consistent with what Ashley talked about. This is within the context of approved uses of funds. So in other words, if the referendum would pass and the agency was going to use their tax dollars, what would they want their money to be used for? So this is approved uses of funds, right? Drinking, 92% approved using the funds for protecting their drinking water. The numbers in parentheses next to them are the strongly approved. So we always look at intensity, not just the overall support, but the intensity of that support. This is huge, 92 approved with 79 strongly approved. General water quality, 91 and 74. Reduced flooding, 89, 69 strongly approved. Wetlands. And then we put a sentence together. Protect watersheds to improve water quality of rivers, lakes, and streams. You can add flooding to that sentence and even make it stronger. So there is a money message right there for all of us. We have to, as land conservation professionals, we have to link the land conservation work we do to improving people's water. It's as simple as that. And Ashley's data supports that. Other messages, nature education for kids, again, approved uses of funds, 89 and 65. Improving air quality and planting trees, 87 and 68. Good messages, linking what we do to providing places for kids to be outside and linking what we do in land conservation to improving our air quality. Protecting wildlife habitat. Endangered species, a real quick point on this. When you're talking to rural voters, we don't say endangered species, we just say wildlife habitat. When we talk to suburban voters, we talk about both wildlife habitat and endangered species. Protect natural lands. Also, a lot of support for various passive outdoor recreation, trails for walking and biking. I saw a study that said that when you talk to older people, you don't use the word hiking, you use walking. When you talk to younger people, you don't say walking, you say hiking. So again, it all depends on who you're talking to, what words and phrases you use. And there's data to support those kind of nuances. Outdoor recreation for fishing, hiking, and picnicking. These are all strong messages and all related to the work we do in land conservation. Future generations, we call these the altruistic messages. We owe it to our children and grandchildren to save our county's open space, clean water and wildlife, so future generations can enjoy them the way we do. 91 agreed, 72 strongly agreed. And here's another way to say it. Our county's land, water, and wildlife are our natural heritage. We have a responsibility to protect and preserve them for future generations. This is an agree, disagree kind of a question. 93 agree with 69 strongly agree. Not that Democrats and independents don't think these are important. I will tell you right now, for whatever reason, Republicans and conservative voters feel the strongest about these messages related to future generations. So if I'm talking to the DuPage Republican Party, this is my first slide. This is going to get their attention, and this is going to be able to allow me to hook them into what I want to talk about. So knowing these kind of nuances, what kind of messages appeal to different kind of audiences and political affiliations is helpful to connect people to your organization and your mission. For the first time, we asked questions around the whole Nature RX health thing. Do people understand the connection between spending time outside and their health? Everybody can relate to this. In today's digital age, it is more important than ever to provide parks, playgrounds, sports, recreation programs, and places where children can play and be physically active. 89 agreed, 79 strongly agreed. The people that felt the strongest about this message were older voters and mothers with kids, women with kids. And here's a little different way to say it. Forest preserves, parks, and recreation areas play a vital role in fighting obesity, promoting the physical and mental health of our community. 79, but look at the intensity. It's less than half. And they're both good messages. The top one is the stronger message. A good quality of life message that we use all the time in all of our campaigns and in our literature is just preserving natural areas, wildlife habitat, water resources, and providing outdoor rec areas is very important to preserving our quality of life. Everyone can use this message. Everyone could put this in their brochures. 90 agree, 63 strongly agree. This is a good quality of life message. And this is what people care about. You know, they're not necessarily into the bugs and bunnies and the pollinators. This is what they care about. Were there any surprises or trends? Well, we're told that we should never say the word resilient, sustainable, or ecosystems, or watersheds. We've been saying watersheds forever. We don't have a problem with that. But I don't know if we have a good educated suburban voter base or what, but 87% of the people agreed with this statement. 65 strongly agreed that, yes, use my money to create and maintain resilient and sustainable ecosystems. And maybe they really didn't know what it meant. It just sort of sounded cool and they agreed. I don't know, but it's a strong message, I think, nonetheless. Use my money to preserve land to help mitigate the effects of climate change. 73-54. That's not a bad message. What we do when we preserve and restore land is we help mitigate the negative impacts of climate change. So say it. Interesting, and this has been consistent in all of our polls, when asked if people's property taxes are already too high and we need to draw the line on taxes, 72% of the people will agree with that. But then immediately if they're asked if $2 a month is a small price to pay to preserve and protect open space, 80% of the people agree with that statement. So just because people say their taxes are too high and we need to draw the line on taxes doesn't mean that they won't spend a couple dollars a month to preserve and protect open space, because it's important to them, even the people who say they're anti-tax. Those that said that the economic concerns were their top priority. So we asked questions in the poll like what their priorities are, what are their major concerns where they live. Those that said high taxes, jobs, and other economic issues were their highest concerns, the majority of them still said they would support a referendum. And then finally, and this is the first time we've ever seen this in a poll, is that it doesn't matter whether there's growth or sprawl, or whether people feel their county is growing too fast, too slow, or at the right pace. The majority of the people, regardless of how they felt about growth and sprawl, said that they would support a referendum. And we've always had a correlation in our previous polls, and we've always felt, we had a hypothesis that The more sprawl and growth is going on in a community, the more people will support a referendum because they want to preserve some open space. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It doesn't matter whether their community is growing or not. They want to preserve open space. So again, we did this within the context of a hypothetical referendum. At the very beginning of our poll, we always ask people, with them knowing very little, if anything, about a hypothetical referendum, if they would vote for it or not. We use that as baseline data. So at the beginning of the poll, 71 said they would support it, 39 definitely. Then we tell them it's going to cost them some money. And we just use 24 a year because that seems to be the average. And 69 support, 41 definitely. So the overall support went down a little bit, but the overall intensity went up a little bit. Like, $24 is nothing. I support it. And then at the end of the survey, once they learn more about the referendum, they've heard positive arguments, they've heard negative arguments, and we always test negative arguments because we want to know what arguments would be working against us in a campaign. The overall support was 76, with 43 definitely. Now, we have about a 2.8 margin of error. Our pollster, which is John Wilson, who used to be with American Viewpoint, which is a GOP polling firm, he said, just to be safe, knock an additional 5 points off because it's hypothetical. People will agree with a hypothetical over a real one. So, let's just say we knocked off 10 points. We're still looking at 2/3 of the voters still supporting a referendum. And then real quickly, you can, if you're from up in this area, you can see how each of your counties fared with this. I'm going to skip that because I'm running out of time. I just want to focus on making sure everyone knows that we have to link what we do with improving people's quality of life, link what we do with water, improving our air quality, wildlife habitat, creating places for people to be outside. And don't forget to talk about, we have a responsibility to pass something on to future generations. So stay out of the weeds, focus on the quality of life messages. Talk to people at a level where they are at, not where you are at or where you want them to be. Again, connect preserving land with all of these things that we just talked about that are important to people. Conservation also solves problems like flooding. Conservation makes my life better. Within the talk about what we do within the context of healthy communities. And my final message is we are winning. No one can say that people don't care about this stuff. 90% of our referendum have passed in Northeastern Illinois, and 100% of all the forest preserve referendum have passed over the past 25 years. So no one can say people don't care about this stuff. It's not true.
Thanks, Brooke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You just need to stop sharing the screen. Okay, so we haven't had, really haven't had many questions. There is one, Brooke, I think this is for you, a question about the 77% of white voters were in. Is that?
That's representative of what the pollsters feel in the collar counties.
Okay.
Northeastern Illinois will be showing up for the November 2020 referendum. I don't know if it's fair or not. I mean, I got to rely on these guys. They're the experts.
Okay. So there's so what surprises folks about the results? Oh wait, hold on. There's a question here from Mila. Is there any support that this messaging of connecting to health will support direction of resources specifically for environmental justice alleviation? Is there any, did either of you get any sense of connections to environmental justice issues?
We didn't poll that specifically. Yeah. Our polling was designed around whether a referendum would pass or not.
Yeah, and for us, the closest we got to asking a question about environmental justice was a messaging point on equity, and that was specifically a message around the fact that everyone deserves a chance to enjoy the outdoors. This fund will help ensure that our underserved communities, particularly those who live in big cities, have access. That's the closest we got. And that message, I thought I had it up here. It did resonate strongly in larger cities versus smaller cities, but that it did receive midline support. It was not the top tier message for why folks would want to invest in conservation.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't do better than that.
So Brooke, there's a surprise here that support for protecting open space does not go up in areas where there's a lot of development pressure.
I think that's a new thing. That's always been what we have been working on, the correlation between development pressure and open space. We always used to say the best time to pass a referendum is when there's a bunch of sprawl, and that's always been the case. Our data in 2019 does not support that. And I don't know if it will support it in the future. You know, we'll keep doing these polls and look back and compare. I think this is a good thing, that people want to preserve open space regardless of whether sprawl and development is occurring, and that's good. That's a shift in the right direction.
Yeah. So the next question is, given the data that are presented and your knowledge of voters, what additional messages do you think might resonate? And folks can unmute themselves if you just want to say something to the group instead of typing into the chat box. Oh, that's a good question from Lenore. Where did conservation rate relative to other problems or concerns?
So that is a great question. We did not ask that question. We made an assumption that it would not rank very highly, particularly in the state of Illinois that's facing significant fiscal issues and many other issues that I could spend a very long time discussing with you guys. But we have done some national polling on that. And so although we don't have very specific Illinois data, I could probably, Lenore, dig up how it ranks in terms of some national priorities. And depending on what topic it is, it does, although it doesn't rank as highly as things like, military aid and like those big tier issues, I do think a couple of them do kind of sneak up, in a top 10 or top 15 nationally.
We did ask those questions. In fact, that's a common question we ask in all of our polls. I didn't have a slide in on it. Prior to 2008, conservation ranked a lot higher than it does today. It doesn't rank very high today. Saying that, though, for the people that didn't rank it high, but ranked things like the economy and jobs and keeping my taxes down, like I said, the majority of them still said that they would support a referendum to preserve open space. So again, just because people don't rank conservation as their top concern in their community, it doesn't mean that they won't support a referendum as long as the amount is reasonable. And again, it's sort of hard to argue with $2 a month.
Great, thank you. So here's a great question from Vera. With climate change as the top issue of extreme concern in Illinois shown in the first survey, how do we incorporate that in messaging effectively? Also, I'm curious to see where Republican or independent voters in Illinois are at in terms of climate change concern compared with Democrats.
Yeah, I do believe, I hope I'm off mute. Yeah, I do believe that was definitely a partisan issue. So Republicans and independents were much less likely to say that that was an extreme or very important issue for them. I certainly could dig up the specific crosstab information on that question if folks are really interested, but And then in addition to that, the Nature Conservancy has also done a completely separate national poll just on climate change and energy with a specific focus on conservative voters. So things like talking about climate change in terms of energy independence resonates very strongly with conservative voters versus talking about, you know, greenhouse gas emissions, which is preferred among Democratic voters. And so there are some distinctions to be made there.
Yeah, in the suburbs, we didn't really find much of a difference in how people felt about that, you know, based on their political affiliation. And again, you know, the voter demographic in the suburbs is changing. It's a lot different than what it used to be. So I think, at least up here, we should be talking about how what we do helps mitigate the impacts of climate change. Remember, conservation solves problems. Conservation makes my life better. So by preserving and restoring land, making them healthy and resilient, we are helping to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about that.
Whoops. You're muted. We don't hear you, Lisa.
Sorry. Thank you, Todd. So Ashley and Brooke, do you have any advice for Ilana and other folks on how to start talking about drinking water in their messaging, since they currently talk about water quality, but not drinking water specifically?
Well, it's interesting. You talk to people in DuPage County, they get their water from Lake Michigan, but there's clearly a link between, and people understand that there's water on the ground and in the ground. And, you know, I tell people, even though you don't get your drinking water from underground now, you might in the future, and your grandkids might. So you just can't ignore it just because you get your water from the lake. Preserving land helps create areas where water can infiltrate into the ground, recharge our aquifers, and the water gets clean on its way down. In areas, particularly in rural areas, they know that. They know where their water comes from. If you're on a well or if you're on a community well, people know where the water comes from. If you're in an urban area, maybe they don't. But in the suburban area we're at, and some of our suburbs or some of our collar counties have rural areas, they know where the water comes from. And the people out in the rural areas support clean water just like people anywhere else.
Thanks, Brooke. There were a couple of questions that are related to the demographics in the surveying. So was there any information collected on whether or not people were raised in Illinois versus outside of Illinois? And were there any questions asked that got at education level?
So no to the first one. We did not do that demographic on whether or not they were raised here, but yes, we do have we have information both on income level for the household and for education level. I just didn't have time to get into those particular demographics today, but we do have that for each question that we asked. And there are some interesting trends.
Great, thank you. And then I have another question here. Did any of the testing include benefits related to animal habitats?
Well, we tested wetlands and we tested wildlife habitat in general. And again, you know, we're talking to voters, and I think if you can connect with someone in your communication by talking about what we do protects wildlife habitat, that's going to get their attention because wildlife habitat tested high. And if you want to get into pollinators and into some of the specifics or into the weeds, you know, you may be able to go there, but we always try to lead with wildlife habitat, and then that conversation may go wherever.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions? Or our final, I guess, question for the group is, what ideas do you have for getting these messages out to people? Let's see. Let's see, I've got one. Can the referendum for more open space be revisited before the Cook County Board? Brooke, I think that's for you.
Sure. Talk to Preckwinkle and Governor Pritzker.
So here's a good one from Rebecca. How are you, Conservation Foundation and TNC, using these results? Are you sharing them with elected officials?
Very much so. I mean, I've given this is probably my 15th presentation on this. We're going around to each of the counties. And Elizabeth, I saw your name on here, and I haven't been up to McHenry County yet, but I've been to every other county, and I've shared with all the forest preserve districts, the staff. We have a public version of our study, sort of an executive summary that we're sharing. We're not sharing all the details, but we do have sort of a public version that I feel safe sharing.
And what kind of reaction are you getting?
It's sort of mixed. You know, people that have been in the business a while aren't surprised, you know, because like I said, 90% of the referenda have passed over the past 25 years. So why would you be surprised? Other people that might be sort of new, especially some of the elected officials, I think some of them are like, yeah, the 6 people at the coffee house tell me that, you know, that nobody cares about this. And you know, they base their whole opinion on the 6 people at the coffee house. That's why we do the polling to show them there's more than 6 people out there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just add, we use these results pretty heavily during the entire month of May when capital budget conversations were ongoing. I mean, we got a pretty positive reaction from folks, but again, it was a super crazy session. And so this issue did tend to get buried under some of the more significant proposals that were floating around the Capitol around the same time. But we are gearing up to continue to share these results with our legislators. And then same as Brook, we do have a couple of memos that are public facing that we can share with staff and anyone at any organization. So if folks are interested, we can certainly send those around. And I can share the national stuff as well as the state stuff.
So Brooke, there's a request here, and thank you both for that. There's a request here, if you could share your screen that had the slides, that had the messages that test well.
Not for Sarah, sorry.
Okay.
Along with that was, will we be able to share the slides, both of your slides, afterwards? Is that something? Okay.
Absolutely. 100%.
We'll make those available to all, emailed out and through, they'll be on the Vital Lands Illinois website, along with the recording of this whole presentation.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to email me separately, I can send you the presentation also.
Great. Thank you, Brooke. Any other questions? No? Yes, thank you for sure. You'll note in the chat box the evaluation. There's a link to the evaluation there. So if folks could just take 2 minutes and do that, that will help us out a lot. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you so much, Ashley and Brooke, for excellent presentations, really great information. Yeah, this is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
Are we done?
Thanks, everyone. This was terrific.
Yeah. If folks just want to